So I got Aaron. We just took a break. He's doing dad stuff right now, but I wanted to talk about compare and contrast conjugate method training versus tier training, because that applies to kind of how we've set up our programs. And a lot of people have heard, so just kind of jumping right in, a lot of people have heard the term conjugate training.
Yep.
The West Side Barbell guys, Louis Simmons, these guys talked about it a lot, and we saw the result of it, or we've seen the results of it. It's very well known, I think, as a training method. One, because they made it popular. Two, because it works. It works. It 100% works. Tier training is a little lesser known, and likely just because it hasn't made its way into social media the way the West Side Barbell guys made conjugate training so popular. But they're both again, these training methodologies that we approach overall programming with is kind of the higher level way of looking at, like, how do you divide up the things that you're trying to get done from a modalities perspective, right? How do you do that and make it work the best for you to train all the things? And that's always the challenge for any athlete. But there's probably some very basic things that we can kind of outline for people so that they understand, and then how they relate to kind of how we put things together for folks, and why we did it, and how we're utilizing those. And I think the better understanding you have of this as a consumer or as an exerciser, or however you want to look at it, the better connection you'll have to what you're doing, but more specifically why you're doing it. Yeah. So let's just start with like the conjugate method at kind of a high level. So
conjugate was originally created by Louis Simmons of West Side Barbell. That is the training system that they used. It is a combination of the Bulgarian system and the Soviet system.
We just talked about those guys being like the OGs for figuring a lot of this stuff out.
They knew how to program for strength.
If you're a nerd and you dig into any literature on strength, power training, the Eastern Europeans knocked this stuff out of the park. They figured it out a long time ago. If you watch the Olympics or the Pan Am Games or anything like that, those guys are always podiuming.
Granted, those guys a lot during the heyday. There's a little bit of PEDs being used.
I think that may have happened at West Side a little bit too, but I'm not sure. So.
Maybe just a little bit.
Anyways.
But so it's a combination of those two. Essentially what it is, it alternates between a max effort day, so a very heavy intensity day, and a dynamic day where it's a lot more of reps and volume. It's 2 days. As of right now, their system is a max effort lower day, max effort upper day, recovery day, max effort, a dynamic lower, dynamic upper. Is what their website will show as their template.
So max effort, let's kind of define like max effort versus dynamic.
Right. So max effort was essentially just a raw strength building. Okay. Low reps, low volume, high load. High weight, low reps. High intensity. The intensity is there for, I think, all of them. Yeah. It just depends. The volume and the load alternate.
Okay. And so what about dynamic?
So dynamic would be more volume, lower loads. So essentially like hypertrophy training, accessory work, that kind of thing. Now, I don't know the details exactly of how they program, but that is the concept. Yeah,
it can vary depending on where they are in their seasons, what they're competing for. So I think one of the things to note here, a couple of things. First off, for Louis Simmons, those are powerlifting guys, right? That are purely focused on that raw strength, force production. And so when you look at like what they're doing, it's lifting and pushing heavy stuff.
Heavy freaking weights.
And so that's where that method came into play. And again, that goes back to, going to the Eastern Europeans and kind of what they've done there and kind of what they mastered, and then them taking it and finding their own way to do it. So the other thing that comes up with that is that they're hitting things more than once a week.
Right.
And because that's what this method of programming allows you to do, balance the volume intensity. If you're curious about that, we've done a podcast on that. You'll hear it. If you haven't already heard it, make sure you go back and listen to it so you understand this. But when you understand that, then you understand how to hit things in more than one time per week. So the old-fashioned, body part splits or whatever, where we're murdering our chest and triceps on Monday and then not hitting them again, specifically or directly until the following Monday, kind of thing.
It's an all-encompassing lower day.
Right.
All-encompassing upper day.
So you're getting more volume in one workout, and then you're also getting more volume in the week by hitting the thing more than once.
Right.
So, and that's actually been adopted by the bodybuilding world quite a bit now when you start to look at what those splits look like versus what I just described. So
I've seen a lot of them do 6-day splits where they do up, back, lower, chest, and then back, lower, chest again. So they're hitting it twice a week versus the old school way of hitting it once a week.
Right. So what we're doing, again, this is really a balance of volume and intensity, which are important variables to really understand in terms of both the short-term effects you can get from that and the long-term effects. And it's about giving the minimum effective dose. Again, that doesn't mean it's lightweight when I say minimum. It means with the volume and intensity, giving it exactly what it needs to get the most out of it, to recover back beyond baseline so that you can throw another stimulus at it again, right? Maybe at a lower intensity, right? And that second time, right? To then get that training effect, to then take it into the next week and do that thing again.
The other piece of conjugate, sorry.
No, go ahead, man.
The other piece of conjugate that I really like is they rotate in 9-week cycles.
That's what I was going to say.
They're doing different variants of lifts every single week. All still same thing like we talked about in a previous podcast. It's a movement. They're still working that squat pattern. It may be a box squat, front squat, chain squat, speed squat, back squat, and then so on and so forth. And they're rotating through those, and they're trying to hit quote unquote PRs essentially every single time. And so by the next time they go through the 9 weeks, those other 8 weeks are helping them build that movement pattern that they just did 9 weeks ago.
So while the movement pattern is let's call it the same, right? It's a squat pattern. You get variability or variation in the actual exercises that you're picking, right, to do that movement pattern through that programming, which I think is important for people. One, because it helps you build skill in that movement pattern, but in that specific exercise. It also helps with the boredom piece a little bit.
Absolutely.
It also helps you get out of continually doing what you're good at doing. Like you might be very good at front squatting, but you have maybe back squatting, but you have some mobility issues, maybe in the shoulder or in your wrists, or in your posterior chain somewhere that makes front squatting a little bit more difficult for you. Kind of, I don't want to say it forces you, but it encourages you to get into that and get better at the things you might not be good at. So overall, that method is very well rounded, and it hits those other components that we just talked about. Is there anything else you want to say about conjugates?
No, the only thing is it is a very powerlifting specific method of training.
That's the last thing that I want to say before we move on in terms of the compare and contrast against the tier system, which we'll get into in Ken's stuff. But or Kent, is it Ken or Kent?
Ken.
Yeah, Ken, sorry. In that this is built, again, for raw strength, right? And it was built they built it for the West Side guys. So think about that athlete. Think about exactly what it is that their goal is or was, right, at the time that they were putting this together and why they utilize it. It is simply force production, right? There is power component, speed and power component as they get into maybe a meet, because powerlifting is about speed and power, but you have to have the raw strength in order to perform this, or to elicit the speed and power that can come along with it. And so the point of that is it's really built for, like, you're trying to get big, jacked, and strong. Like, the conjugate method that's what it's built to do.
Absolutely.
100%. However, if your job or your job as an athlete requires you to have more than just raw strength, it does leave some things off the table.
Yeah, and that's where the tier system comes in. So the tier system is essentially athletic-based training. And that's how Joe Kinn, he was a longtime strength coach for the Carolina Panthers. And then he went off and started his own company. But he's got a long resume in the athlete world, specifically football. Yeah,
and again, going back to who he studied and where this stuff came from, it comes from the same places, right? The basis of it all comes from the same places, but you say it's athletic-based training. We talk about that versus what I just said, because some powerlifters might take offense to this. What are you saying, I'm not an athlete? No, what we're saying is...
So they're working on a little bit more broad spectrum versus bench, squat, deadlift, like powerlifting is trying to get really good at. Athletes need to be well-rounded in all planes of motion, frontal, sagittal, transverse, along with different movement not necessarily movement patterns, but there are some different movement patterns that they need to be a little bit more emphasized because of that particular sport.
Right. You just mentioned it. If you're moving through those different planes of motion, right, those require different combinations of movement patterns. Versus getting on the platform or getting on the bench, where you're doing one of three very, very specific things. You're either moving up and down, right? Or you're moving something up and down versus having to rotate, having to move sideways,
having to change directions,
cutting. That when we start getting into things like how we're applying the plyometric components of what we put in there, but like specifically like on our speed and power days and things like that. So when you say athletic based, it's more, again, it's looking at it from that perspective. We're stepping outside the realm of squat, bench, and deadlift.
Yeah. The main thing is the training is helping you be a better athlete for whatever sport, job you're there trying to do. It's not the main thing. So that's why there's a lot of things covered in that particular set of training. And it boils down to they're focused on multi-joint compound movements and just a broad spectrum of them, but still training those movement patterns. But again, the end goal is to be a better athlete.
Yeah, and so what you'll see actually in some of the basic stuff when we look at it would come from like the Olympic lifting side of things, like right up front. Like they're putting in the very skilled movements up front in that program most of the time. That being like your clean and jerk and your snatch type movements.
Speed and power movements are always at the front, and then it progresses into the strength. It follows the typical NSCA guidelines of the prep, speed and power, strength movements, and then accessory and conditioning following at the end.
Yeah, so it's a little, again, I think the right term is it's a little bit more broad spectrum, and it's not to take away from anything that's involved in the Conjugate program, because we've adopted a lot of that in our programming. The point of it is like if you need to be a more mobile, more agile, faster athlete, then the tier system starts to play into this a little bit more as you get down the line. Now, if you're new, right, to this and you lack that raw strength or you lack that strength, then the tier system might not be the right place for you to start. You may want to be spending more time in more of a conjugate style training program, because it's going to help you build the base for the more athletic movements that you need to do later.
Yeah, you can't move a bar fast if you're not strong enough to pick the weight up in the first place.
Right. So that's the kind of the basis of it. So how is it applied sort of in our program when people are looking across, okay, so where does this fit in? We have it just real quick. We have our basic static programs. When I say basic, I just mean they're basic. A basic way to understand them is we have a strength focused program.
They're focused on a particular skill set that you're trying to build.
Right. So we have that strength focused program. We have a speed and power focused program, and we have a capacity focused program. And we have our performance based program, which is going back to the beginning of that. It's not that you're not working any speed or power or capacity when you're doing your strength programming.
It's just not the emphasis.
It's not the emphasis. Right. We're focusing on this other thing a bit more, right? And same again, when you go to speed and power and capacity, it's not that you're not getting any strength or capacity in the speed and power program. So that's the definition. And then, or the clarification there. And then as you get in again to the performance track, it's all of the things all the time.
All the things all the time.
As evenly balanced as we can keep them, and we've made them make sense throughout the week as you're performing these workouts.
There's a lot more load management and energy management because you have to be ready at all times.
So where does more of the conjugate method show up?
So the conjugate shows up in our program as we rotate the lifts. Right. We don't necessarily go the nine lifts and rotate them throughout the 9 weeks. We usually go 2 to 3. So we'll have 1 week on in like an A week, one lift. B week is a different lift. A week, B week, or we go A, B, C, depending on just the type or the bias for that particular cycle.
Yeah, and you bias the squat there earlier in your example. So you're maybe doing a back squat in A week and a front squat in B week.
Yeah.
So you're
same movement pattern, a little different emphasis, different intensity need.
But then you're coming back to the back squat in C week, which is week 3, right? And then in week D is again the front squat again. So you're getting a chance to really refine the skills and also measure what you're actually doing in those movement patterns. So you're forced to maybe get away again from what you're really good at or what you like to do, but at the same time you're being put in a position to refine some skills that are going to help you. Because if we get into, and we have a YouTube video on this specific to front squat, back squat, the different variations of squatting and the advantages, the pros and the cons to each, based on who you may be as an individual or what you're trying to achieve, but understanding that they're both very important for very specific reasons. That's why we put them in there. We're not just picking, exercises out of thin air because we want to give people variety and that's it. No, it's, yes, we want to give them variety, but there's deeper layers to that, which we'll obviously we get into in another format. So what about the tier-based stuff?
So the tier-based is essentially how the layout of each day is. So the emphasis is the speed and power and the athletic movement, and then it progresses into the strength piece after typically each day, because that strength piece is going to amplify the ability to produce force in the speed and power realm. And then we finish off with our accessory and capacity, because those have a lesser emphasis in this particular...
In that day.
That day, right. Yeah. So some days we do have a full volume day. It's just not the same as a strength day. We do, I mean, I even program it throughout the week. Speed and power emphasis on Monday, strength bias on Tuesday, volume bias on Thursday. It even progresses throughout the week that way.
Yeah, if you're confused by this, don't be. Like, that's our job is to put that together and put it in a way that's easily, all you got to do is bring it up, look at it, and know this is what I'm doing for the day, and trust that it's been put together in that way. But we're not trying to reinvent the wheel is the point you're making.
I've always said every strength coach is doing the same thing. They're just marketing it different.
Yeah, or like, again, they're doing it for specific athletes that's specific to their role or their job. So that's all this is. It's just taking the best of what we know works and what's out there through science, through application, through competition, right? Where it's been quote unquote pressure tested, if you want to use that term, that it works. And so again, part of that is, if you've not done this before, maybe you've heard these terms or you've only worked in this one realm, understand that there's always more than one way to skin a cat. There's also no one size fits all. All of that has its value, and we're trying to take and extract as much value as we can out of each of those things and make them work for people through the week. And a lot of it making it work for people, again, is just taking the guesswork out of it.
Absolutely.
Like just being able to walk in and know, like, I'm doing these things today, trust the process, be consistent, know that you might suck at one thing a little bit more than another, and that's okay. You're going to get an opportunity to get better at it. And not just because we want you to be better at the front squat versus the back squat. Like, that's not the only reason, because it provides value down the line.
Keeps the main thing, which is work for this population.
Yeah, and the movement, right? So like, how do you become a better mover, which then translates over like to the shooting side of things, to the sprinting, chasing people down, jumping over walls, fences, moving through tight spaces, around corners, things like that. Again, the movement piece, where the strength, the speed, the power, the capacity, those are the things that you're going to need in order to be able to do that well, consistently, be resilient to the things that can happen when you're trying to do those things, a trip, a fall, a slip, or whatever, or having to do it for a very long time, right? Over, a long duration of time. That's the way our brains think when we're looking at it. Again, there's no perfect way to do any of that. We've just tried to boil it down and continue to refine it to make it work best for people.
How I programmed a year ago is not the same way I program now. The same base structure is there.
The fundamentals.
The fundamentals are there.
Foundationally, nothing's changed.
Yeah, foundationally, nothing's changed. But through feedback and testing it out again myself, it is just formed into what it is now.
Yeah, and it's not just you. It's something you mentioned on another podcast, is we have a development group that goes through this program. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so those development groups are guys who are in the field doing the thing. It could be a part-time SWAT guy, full-time gang unit, full-time federal team. There's about 20 guys on there, and they come from all different walks of life. And like, some guys got 5 kids, some has no kids, some is a single dude who's just able to train all the time on a full-time team. So there's a large variety. So I'm getting feedback from all those different guys on like, hey, this is how it applies to my particular set.
Or doesn't, for whatever.
Or doesn't apply. Right. Yeah. So I'm getting a lot of feedback, and I'm able to like assess that, break it down. Okay, this is, and then formulate it all into how can I best help everybody in this particular population.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Again, it's just like putting it out into practice, because you can sit in your little lab, right? And a lot of people do that. They'll come up with programs based on the text, right? Or what this NFL coach did with this player to get him to be this thing. We've talked about that on other podcasts too. This is, again, the laboratory exists beyond the walls of the laptop, right? In the home office or on the road, in the hotel room, putting stuff together. And it's this constant feedback mechanism that we're able to get. And part of that is just with having people that trust what we're doing, have success with what we're doing, even failures, which
I definitely failed early on. I did what you were talking about. I was in the lab, and I was like, this is, in theory, this looks great. This is going to be what they want. Yeah. And then found out this is not what it was going to be applicable for them. And so I had to change it, drop my pride, and move on to adding some things that maybe I didn't fully agree with, but it's what they wanted, based off of that particular job set?
Yeah. So again, I started the thing talking about the theories, right? And kind of the larger overall perspective of what these two methods, conjugate versus the tier training system, look like. But the more important part, I think, is the application and what's been refined through application and kind of where we are now. So easy to find out about that. You just go to our website, inextremisperformance.com. You can read a little bit about it. There's an ability to get into like 1 week trials and things like that, get samples of what it is that we do if you're still confused, or more importantly, like if you want to talk about it. And we're starting to do this more. I think now that we understand, like people have very specific questions, which is why we're actually handling this talk today. People have asked like, hey, I've been doing this thing over here. I've been doing 5x5s. I've been doing conjugate method. I've been doing all this stuff. Like, how does this apply, or do I have to stop doing that? No, in fact, it's in the programming, right? We can't, aside from you doing it and getting into it and seeing the whole thing, we can have a dialogue about it to see where it might fit in best for you. And quite frankly, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's not the right program for you, but let's take an opportunity and find out if it is or it isn't. Simply reach out, hit the contact page there. We got social medias everywhere. You'll see us on there every day. If you go to Instagram, you'll see us on YouTube. Hit us up, and we'll do our best to guide you in the right direction, answer any questions you might have, help you be as successful as we can.